Okay, we are now on the air. Welcome to this special presentation at Kaiju Masterclass. I am Patrick Galvan. I am one of the co-organizers for this convention. And we are here today to discuss a rather unfortunate topic. A little over a month ago, on November 15th, it was announced that screenwriter, director, and educator Kazuki Omori had passed away. Mr. Omori needs no introduction to followers of this channel, but he was the writer and director of 1989's Godzilla vs. BIOLLANTE, the writer-director of 1991's Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah. He also wrote the screenplays for 1992's Godzilla vs. MOTHRA and 1995's Godzilla vs. Destoroyah. The latter two were the highest-grossing Japanese films of their respective years. Mr. Omori had actually died November 12th, 3 days before the announcement of his passing had come out. He had died of acute myeloid leukemia, cancer of the blood, a disease which hits rather quickly. He was 70 years old. And of course, his death was widely mourned throughout the Kaiju fan community. Lots of people grew up loving the two films that he wrote and directed and the two that he just wrote the screenplays for. And he is widely recognized for bringing a lot of fresh ideas to the Godzilla franchise at a time when the franchise really needed it. And of course, as a fan myself, I had a number of thoughts about Mr. Omori after he had passed away. First, aside from just being sad, as I always am about the passing of anybody involved with this franchise that myself and many others love, I thought about his movies, and I also thought about him as he kind of fits into the historical mold of the Godzilla franchise. On a basic note, I thought about how when I myself was first getting into Godzilla in the early 2000s, all four of the Godzilla directors of the 80s and 90s were still with us, And now with Mr. Omori's passing, only one of them is still alive. That is Takao Okawara. And so for a fan of my generation, that's a very unusual feeling. I also thought about him in the sense that of all the directors, and on top of that, he was also the only director of that cycle and the first director in the franchise to be a freelancer who was hired from outside the Toho system and not somebody who was hired from within the studio to direct Godzilla, which we'll get into more later. But I also thought about him in regards to his contemporaries of the 80s and 90s. He was the only director of that cycle of films to have a really full-fledged, sustained directing career. Whereas Okawara, Koji Hashimoto, and Kensho Yamashita each directed one or two films before Godzilla and directed nothing at all once their time with the monster was done. Kazuki Omori was a established filmmaker before he got the chance to direct Godzilla, made a large number of films before Godzilla vs. BIOLLANTE, and made a large number of films after Godzilla vs. BIOLLANTE. So he had a very full, sustained directing career, which makes him pretty noteworthy compared to his contemporaries of that cycle of films. And for that reason, and for many other reasons, I thought it was absolutely worth the chance to... helps if I... Hold on a second. We're very prepared here at Kaiju Masterclass. To discuss Mr. Omori's career. And on a final personal note, I would like to also mention that Mr. Omori was actually a guest at Kaiju Masterclass last November. Myself and Steve Rifle had a very fun, exciting, and very illuminating conversation with him about his career, about the Godzilla films he worked on, about what his visions were, his intentions were with the films that he worked on, and just talking about his background as a filmmaker and somebody who just loved movies from a young age and wanted to be a director from a young age. And so I strongly encourage people who, if they have not seen that interview, to go check it out on our YouTube channel. It's about an hour long. He was very funny, very candid, very forthcoming, and a very nice, polite person, and just very fun to talk to. And I think that comes through very much so in the interview that he gave Steve and I. And I also would like to thank him for taking time out of his very busy schedule. He was, in his later years, he was a professor at Osaka University of Arts, and didn't have a whole lot of spare time in his hands, but he still made time to talk about these films that, myself and our viewers all love and people around the world love so much. And so that's a very positive thing to say about him as well as a person. Anyhow, so like I said, Mr. Omori had a pretty long, extensive career, and I thought it'd be absolutely worthwhile, in addition to honoring him, to also just talk about, his life and his career as a filmmaker. And that's going to be the topic of this conversation today. Mr. Omori was born in March of 1952. He came from a family of doctors. His father was a doctor, and he was kind of expected by his family to follow the family tradition and become a doctor himself once he grew up. But from a young age, he was very fascinated by motion pictures. When he was in kindergarten or preschool, he was taken to see Honda Ishiro's original 1954 Godzilla and was absolutely terrified by it, and kept watching Japanese science fiction pictures throughout the 1950s and 60s. As he grew a little older, he became fascinated by films of the French New Wave and by Hollywood movies. And when he was a young man, like say 10 or a little above 10, his father took him to see The Longest Day, which was Daryl Zanuck's large, bombastic World War II epic. And that was the film that Mr. Omori told Steve Reifel and I that transformed him into a quote unquote movie freak. And he was very keen on one day making movies himself. However, at that time, there was no. This is this time in the 1960s and 70s. The film industry in Japan is a fraction of what it had been, say, some years earlier. The apprentice system that had thrived at places like Toho and Shuchiku is either gone or very quickly going away, and there was no real strong set pattern to become a filmmaker at this point in time, and there was no real promising guarantee of anything that you could make a living in a future in motion pictures. And so even though he was very keen on movies and very keen on making movies, he ended up for his continued education, studying in a different field. As I mentioned, his father was a doctor. He came from a family of doctors, and he just did the quote unquote family thing and entered medical school. He went to medical school in Kyoto. However, during this time, he did not give up his adoration for motion pictures. In addition to shooting 8mm films and 16mm films in high school, while he was in medical school, he wrote screenplays, and actually one of his scripts, a script called Orange Road Express, which he wrote in 1977, he submitted it to the Kido Awards, which is a contest that I think is still held in Japan, and it won the top prize at the Kido Awards and was received an invitation to be adapted into a film by Shochiku the following year. And Omori had the chance to not only see his script produced, but to direct it himself. And so he directed Orange Road Express in the following year, 1978. Throughout his remaining years in medical school, he was still writing scripts and working on movies, directing films. And in fact, he devoted so much time to this side hustle of his that he spent an additional 2 years in medical school. Typically, Japanese medical school lasts 6 years. But as he told Steve Reif and I last year, he spent so much time working on movies that he spent 8 years instead of 6 studying medicine. So it gives you an idea of where his heart really was at this point in time, following his dreams and passions to become a filmmaker. And after medical school, he graduated in 1980, and he did not end up becoming a doctor. In 1980, well, I should small correction. He did actually, take the national medical exam in 1983 and become a licensed doctor, but he did not, follow that profession. Namely because in 1980, that was also the year that he released his real breakout film, Disciples of Hippocrates, which is a rather dark, twisted melodrama about medical students and the pressures put upon medical students. By the way, this gentleman in the on the left side of the screen, that's Akira Imoto, whom Godzilla fans will recognize from Godzilla vs. Space Godzilla and Shin Godzilla. Anyhow, so Disciples of Hippocrates was widely acclaimed, got tremendously positive reviews. And Omori credited this film with pushing him down that for securing his path as a director. He said, quote, "You could say I only studied medicine to make this film. However, I don't see my medical studies as a detour, but as a path to becoming a director. However, his road to success as a filmmaker was not completely instantaneous. On the screen here, we see a screen grab from a film called Hear the Wind Sing, which is, I think, one of his more interesting movies that doesn't have a monster in it, but in a sense, almost kind of derailed his career as a filmmaker. This film is actually an adaptation of Haruki Murakami's debut novel of the same title, which was published in 1979. Omori and Murakami were actually fellow alumni from the same junior high school. Omori had joined that school the same year that Murakami was graduating. And Omori's homeroom teacher had actually been Murakami's literature teacher at the school. And Omori was really interested in Hear the Wind Sing. He wanted to make it into a movie, so much so that he sought out Murakami, or rather, he tracked him down at a Tokyo cafe he was known to frequent, and used the fact that they were fellow alumni of the same school to try to kind of win his favor and win approval to adapt his novel into a film, which he did get the permission to do. This film is also interesting in the sense that Omori found himself at kind of a tough challenge in terms of how to make this film. A lot of the novel has a very kind of disjointed structure, and as a lot of Japanese critics pointed out at the time, the characters in Murakami's novel don't really talk like ordinary don't speak in a very everyday ordinary Japanese kind of style. They speaks in a kind of a different sort of vernacular. And Omori recognized this himself and was kind of struggling, how do I translate this kind of text cinematically to the screen? And it occurred to him while he was wrestling with this idea that the characters, the way they kind of talk in the novel, sound kind of like characters from foreign movies when they were subtitled for Japanese releases. It sounded kind of unnatural, but it's interesting at the same time. And he thought, well, there's your answer there. Make the film in a very foreign style manner. And so for inspiration, he sought out, as I mentioned before, he was a fan of the French New Wave, and he took inspiration from Jean-Luc Godard and directed this film in a very Godard-like manner, which I think is one of its most interesting qualities. However, as I mentioned, the release of this film, while it is definitely one of his more interesting pictures, it also kind of threatened his career temporarily. The film cost like 25 million yen to produce, I believe, made back a very small fraction of it. And actually, Omori's friends and colleagues used to tease him that it was because this film bombed so badly that Murakami refused for many years to allow future adaptations of his work. Of course, he's since come around to allowing adaptations of other works of his, such as, Tony Takatani, Norwegian Wood, and perhaps most famously right now, Drive My Car, which Hamaguchi Ryusuke very adapted a couple years ago to immense acclaim. As for Omori, he was not quite done, he hoped, directing Murakami adaptations, because in the mid-'80s, he sought Murakami's permission again to direct another adaptation of his work. However, this time, Murakami declined the invitation. He didn't make an exception for Omori either. He gave him the excuse that he didn't like the way his movies would, how adaptations of his work would be interrupted by commercials when they played on TV, which to me sounds like a very polite, roundabout Japanese way of saying I'm not interested, or I don't want you to do this again. But regardless, he said no, and this ended up being Omori's one adaptation of a Murakami work. Regardless, Omori was very proud of this movie, and years later, when he was teaching film at Osaka University of Arts, he would show this movie, and he was quite proud to learn that his students liked this film the best of everything that he had directed. And again, I think it's absolutely one of his most fascinating movies that doesn't have a monster in it. So, as we can see there, Omori's road to Godzilla was immediately kind of bumpy. You had immense acclaim in the beginning, and kind of a slump afterwards with this film, not being the success that he had hoped for. And so, perhaps for that reason, in 1983, he took the national medical exam, became a licensed doctor. However, he wasn't quite done, working in the film industry, even though he wasn't able to get directing jobs so quickly after the failure of this film, he stayed active. In 1982, he was one of the co-founders of the short-lived directors company, which was around for about 10 years. One of his co-founders included noteworthy people such as Kurosawa Kiyoshi. Produced a large number of Pink films, as well as films such as the excellent horror film Evil Dead Trap from 1988, I believe. He was also directing television and eventually got back around to directing feature films with this film, Pauper's Walk, in 1984. And he was employed at Watanabe Productions when he was scouted by Toho's Tomoki Tanaka to direct Godzilla. This was at a time we were after the release of 1984's The Return of Godzilla, which had done, pretty well at the box office, all things considered, but not quite as strong as the studio had hoped. Toho's goal for the film for 1984 Godzilla was 2 billion yen, and it grossed 1.7 billion yen. So respectable, but a little short of what they were hoping for. After the release of the film, Toho did a lot of extensive audience research, seeing who their demographics were, and they found that 90% of the audience for Godzilla 1984 consisted of college students and elementary kids who had, by this point, been reared on Star Wars and Hollywood entertainment, not unlike Omori. And so the mentality that Tanaka and others had at the time was that, to really excite the audience with the next Godzilla film, they had to seek somebody who was younger and who had kind of a fresh take, somebody who shared the taste of the modern demographic and who could bring a sort of Hollywood style aesthetic to Godzilla and hopefully rejuvenate interest, at a much greater scale in the monster. Omori was actually recommended to Tanaka by a group of fans based in Osaka, where Omori was born. Osaka is his hometown. And Tanaka sought him out, and Omori eventually agreed to work on the film. He was a little hesitant at first because at this point in his life, he's not so into Godzilla anymore. Even though he liked Godzilla when he was a young kid, around the time that he was in junior high school or so, he started to become less interested in the monster, became more fascinated by the French New Wave and by Hollywood films, the James Bond movies, the films of John Sturges, Brian De Palma, his favorite director, John Frankenheimer. And Godzilla at this point had kind of devolved into campy nostalgia for him. And he told Toho this from the beginning, I don't dislike Godzilla, but Godzilla is not something that I really find interesting. And Tanaka sort of talked him into, in a very roundabout Japanese way, into producing the film by saying, well, if you were going to make this film, how would you do it? Which, is a kind of like a coded way of saying, well, please do it. At this time, Toho had conducted a story contest in 1985 to gather ideas for story ideas for the next Godzilla film. Tanaka showed Omori the 5 winning stories, and Omori favored a story that dealt with bioengineering technology, and also he liked elements of a story which had details involving Godzilla's DNA and the international attempt to weaponize Godzilla's DNA. And so he picked those 2 primary scripts as his inspiration for what would eventually become Godzilla vs. BIOLLANTE. Now, Godzilla vs. BIOLLANTE was originally supposed to come out in December of 1986. However, at this time, Toho was producing a film called Young Girls in Love, a teen singer idol film, which had some production issues, and they had Omori step in to direct it. Teen idol films, they cost significantly less than a kaiju film. No special effects, not as complicated productions, and financially safer. You're putting a singing idol, somebody who's popular in the movie, and if it doesn't pan out so well, it wasn't very expensive to begin with, so not a huge loss. So obviously, this film was of a much higher priority to Toho than a Godzilla film, especially a Godzilla film to a sequel, which had not done as well as they had hoped for. So lower cost, less risk, and they had him step in and direct the film. And it came out pretty well, and the film was a gigantic hit. And so during the course of the late 1980s, Toho kept Omori busy directing a large number of teen idol films. 3 of these starred the idol Yuki Saito, who makes a kind of a musical cameo in Godzilla vs. Biollante. As you recall the scene where Godzilla is advancing on Osaka and he interrupts a concert. Well, that's a Yuki Saito song whose concert he is interrupting. And actually, Omori had directed one such film with her called Toto Channel. And there's a scene in that movie where she is on her way to a television shoot, I think. And there's a Toho van that's carting up the Godzilla suit. And there's appropriately an Akira Ifukube musical track playing on the soundtrack. And Omori's professional association with Yuki Saito in particular was so strong that a Toho consultant named Takeuchi Hiroshi later wrote an article about how he and others were kind of disappointed that she was not involved in Godzilla vs. Biollante, was not in the cast for that film. Anyhow, so Omori kept busy during this time working on idol films and other things for Toho, and he was winning up a large number of awards. He won the award for he won an award for the fine arts at the Minister. He won the Minister of Education Award for the Fine Arts in 1988. He won the Art Council's New Director Award for Toto Channel and Women Who Say Goodbye. So he was gathering up a lot of prestige also by working on these other films that Toho was assigning him to while Godzilla vs. Biollante was being dragged out further and further into production. And Godzilla vs. Biollante received kind of a sudden green light in the middle of 1989. Usually with a film of this time period, a Godzilla film of this time period, the film would be greenlit in January. But they received the go-ahead in May of 1989, I believe. And so it was like a rush job to get the film done in time for its December release. As many have noted, Omori was the first truly post-war director to work on Godzilla. He was born in 1952, so he was born at a time when he would have had no direct personal connection to the traumatic events that inspired Godzilla in the first place. And also his collaboration with special effects director Koichi Kawakita, who brought his own visual style to his work, his own kind of aesthetic, really kind of like, put a real, shall we say, new generation stamp on Godzilla versus Biollante, which I think is, in a strange way, kind of appropriate, because even though the 1984 film is the predecessor to this film and inspired the continuity that Biollante and others would follow, the 1984 film is much more like a lot of its predecessors than the films that followed, and was made by people who were had a much stronger connection to the Showa series, like Nakano and Koji Hashimoto, who was Honda's assistant director in the 1960s. So between Omori and Kawakita, they definitely put a very fresh stamp on Godzilla versus Biollante. And so as many have pointed out, it does feel kind of like, a true first Heisei film for the Godzilla franchise, both literally and aesthetically. The script for Godzilla vs. Biollante begins with the following statement. Quote, "This is a scientific film, an adventure film, a war film, a human drama, and a Godzilla film." Omori included lots of references to lots of influences from the West. One of the winning scripts from Toho's contest had included the character of Miki Sayagusa, the psychic girl who would appear in this film and the subsequent Heisei films. But in fleshing her out, Omori took influence from Stephen King's Carrie as he was developing the character into a full-fledged character for his script. Omori described the theme of this film as strong Godzilla. He wanted to create this idea of if something like Godzilla did appear, how would mankind respond to a force that was so powerful and threatening? As he pointed out in an interview, things were much different now than they had been in 1954. 1954, buildings were much smaller. Technology was not as advanced as it was in the late 1980s. The world had come a long way, and so he felt that Godzilla had to be really, presented as a powerful and impressive force, and quote, derived drama from the way in which mankind tries to deal with such an overwhelming force. Despite its very hectic shoot, the film was completed in time. Shooting wrapped in November, and the film was released in December of 1989 to not so exciting box office. The film only grossed about a billion yen, so even less than the 84 film had produced. That said, the film did prevail as a very innovative film with a lot of fresh ideas, and definitely kind of brought Godzilla and gave Godzilla sort of like the boost, the creative boost that it really needed at this point in history. Anyhow, after Godzilla vs. BIOLLANTE, Omori was attached to work on a couple of films that never got produced that featured Mothra. There was the famous Mothra vs. Bagan project, which never went before the cameras due to BIOLLANTE's lower than hoped for box office attendance. He proposed a remake of Mothra vs. Godzilla to get Godzilla into the story and hopefully increase box office potential. But ultimately, Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah was the film that eventually came along in the pipeline. Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah is, in my opinion, certainly not as strong of a movie as Godzilla vs. BIOLLANTE, but I find the film to be actually, in a lot of ways, far more interesting, because within this film's very shambolic, messy script, there is a lot of really fascinating, time capsule moments that kind of distinguish this film from other films in this franchise. The time travel element of this picture was inspired by the fact that, Godzilla vs. BIOLLANTE had not done so well at the box office, while Back to the Future Part 2 had surged at the Japanese box office. And I kind of find it interesting that while Omori introduced the time travel element to hopefully make it a little more appealing, he ended up also at the same time using that element of the film to sort of weaponize socioeconomic things that were happening in Japan at this time period. It's also worth mentioning that Omori was a fan of George Pau's The Time Machine, and shortly before Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, he had directed a film called Mangetsu, which was a time slip type of film about a samurai who gets transported into the present day, a comedy about that subject. So he was obviously interested in time travel. He introduced this element into the film, and again, used it to weaponize the socioeconomic elements that were happening in Japan in the late 1980s. This is the time in the late 1980s we had, the famous bubble economy, where Japan's economic hubris was swelling enormously, and Japan was buying up a large number of properties around the world. In 1988 alone, it was estimated that Japanese corporations had invested $16.5 billion just in the United States. At the same time, they were acquiring properties all around the world. They were acquiring the floating hotels in Vietnam. In London, Japanese companies had issued 10% of all bank loans in that city. And Japanese companies were acquiring up everything from company control of the Rockefeller Center to CBS Records. And it got to the point where USA Today, even though I don't have a screenshot of it on the screen right now, USA Today ran a headline begging the question, will Japan end up buying it all? But what's kind of interesting about Godzilla vs. BIOLLANTE is that it kind of comes along at a point in history where this period of excessive wealth in Japan is actually on its way out. In 1990, October 1990, so a year before the film comes out, that was when the Nikkei stock market had plummeted 48% and brought with it a capital loss of $307 trillion. And by the time that Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah was in theaters, more than 30 Japanese banks were in danger of failing. And all of those Japanese investors were suddenly scrambling to sell their overseas properties. So I find it rather interesting that at a time where this is happening, Omori writes a film that imagines a future in which Japan's economic hubris goes on forever and results in Japan buying up essentially and controlling the entire world. So it's it's kind of an oddity in that sense, but for all those reasons, a very fascinating oddity. And it is one of the more direct films to tackle the subject of the bubble economy, whereas a lot of Japanese films, at least to my knowledge, didn't really address it in a very heads-on manner. Of course, you had things like, Juzo Itami's Taxing Woman series, which savaged vain wealth, but Omori's film really plays up the whole East versus West mentality. And for that reason, it really stands out, not just only amongst the Godzilla franchise of this, in terms of this time period, but also in terms of Japanese films made during the bubble and end of the bubble economy era. The film, of course, was very controversial, as is well known. Even though it was not shown in American theaters, it still caught the attention of news journalists. Was the subject of multiple news programs. PBS and CNN ran stories about the film's perceived anti-American elements, and even more contentious than the film's imagining of a future Japanese global dominion, was, of course, its World War II sequence with the Godzillasaurus, crushing American soldiers while inadvertently and unintentionally saving the Japanese soldiers. Of course, the film was accused of anti-Americanism, especially for this sequence. When Steve Reifel and I interviewed Omori last year, we brought this topic up with him, and he flatly denied that the film was anti-American, and he actually explained the World War II sequence as really just him wanting to make his own kind of version of The Longest Day. As I mentioned, the Daryl F. Zanuck film, The Longest Day, was the film that transformed him into a quote-unquote movie freak. And, with Godzilla, he was able to make, films of a much more expensive scale than he had been able to do as an up-and-coming independent director. So that was his explanation for the World War II sequence. And again, flatly denied that there was anti-Americanism in the film. He also stated that his actual intentions with the film's depiction of Western time travelers trying to stop Japan's future economic reign was not an indulgence of Japan's swelling economic prosperity in the 80s, and that it was not especially pro-Japan. He actually argued that it was rather the opposite, that it was actually kind of anti-Japan or anti-super capitalist Japan. And he in fact described the Western time travelers as, from his perspective, heroes for trying to stop Japan from controlling the entire planet. And within the film's very shambolic script, one can definitely see like little traces of what he's talking about. More than anything, I think this film needed, okay, in addition to many things, this film could have used a few straightforward, speeches, a la what Honda often insisted upon in his film, just to make the film's intention much more clear. But one can still see bits and pieces of what he's talking about. For example, the character of Mr. Shindo, whose corporation is in the film revealed as being a key participant in Japan's one day becoming, the top global economic power. And the fact that Shindo commits a quasi violation of Japan's non-nuclear principles by purchasing a nuclear submarine and docking it outside of Japanese waters to avoid, legal issues, and then rashly sending his nuclear arsenal to revive the monster that he believes to be his successor, to be his savior. And all that happens is Godzilla's already been revived. He attacks the submarine, becomes more powerful, and then turns his destructive powers loose on the prosperous Japan that Shindo had helped create. So within scenes like this, one can see little traces of what Omori is talking about with his claimed intentions of what the film is about. Now, after Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, as I mentioned before, Omori wrote the screenplays for two other Godzilla films, Godzilla vs. Mothra and Godzilla vs. Destroyah. He did not direct these two films. Per his request, he wanted to only work on the screenplays for Godzilla henceforth, because he wanted to sort of divert away from Godzilla and focus more on directing other movies. Because, as the director of a Godzilla film, he's committed to these things for a much longer period of time. But by only writing the screenplays, he can focus his energy as well on films and other genres. And so after Godzilla, after he was done directing Godzilla, he also worked on films that, for example, riffed on the Yakuza underworld. He worked on an anthology film about, hospital patients. And he kept directing a large number of films in other genres. Here is a picture or a couple of images from his 1995 film Broken Heart. It's a romantic comedy about various unrelated characters whose connection is that all their romantic misadventures take place in a amusement park. And here we can see a couple of recognizable faces. There's Mizuno Miki from Gamera 2. In the middle, we have, I'm blanking on his name, but he played the scientist in Godzilla vs. Destroyah. And on the far right, I'm also blanking on his name as well, but we have the mafia scientist guy from Godzilla vs. Space Godzilla. I'm sure somebody in the comments is going to tell us what the names of these two gentlemen are. I'm sorry that I'm blanking on their names at the moment. But and after that, he worked on this centennial project called Night Train to the Stars. This is a film about the Japanese author Kenji Miyazawa. This was a centennial project honoring his 100th, what would have been his 100th birthday. Highly acclaimed film. Won a Japanese Academy Prize, was nominated for 13 other categories, including Best Director and Best Film. And interestingly enough, in this film, Omori plays around with combining animation with live action. There are some points in the film where the protagonist is writing his poems and stories, and he imagines his animal characters from his stories interacting with him while he works. So just, again, right now we're already seeing, a large, a small little sample of the various genres he was delving into. He wasn't just a guy who worked on 2 Godzilla movies. He was a guy who dabbled in a broad spectrum of genres, including animation. This is The Boy Who Saw the Wind. It's based on a novel by C.W. Nicol, who was a European who lived in Japan and wrote about Japan. Again, and also by looking over some of these films, like, we have romantic comedies, we have spoofs on the Yakuza underworld, we have a drama about a poet, we have an animation film. And after this, we have Try, which is a Sino-Korean Japanese co-production about gun smugglers in early 20th century Shanghai. And this is Ken Watanabe on the screen. And what's interesting about these films is that they also kind of really point out just what a real outlier Omori's Godzilla films are in terms of his broad career spectrum. Because the things that really distinguish Omori's Godzilla films, the quick, energetic direction, the homages to Hollywood cinema, that's virtually non-existent in almost all the films I've discussed so far. With really the exception of Try and The Boy Who Saw the Wind, Omori's other films, at least all the ones that I've seen, tend to be rather leisurely, rather more methodical in their pacing. They don't go out of their way to homage Hollywood films. Granted, the homaging of Hollywood films in his Godzilla films, he explained, was really just because, outside of Godzilla, he didn't have the budget to really homage Indiana Jones and whatnot. But regardless, that is just another example of how different his Godzilla films are from his other works. I mean, if you compared Godzilla versus BIOLLANTE to this film in particular, you'd have no idea they're from the same director, because aesthetically they're nothing alike. The story content's nothing alike. So in addition to his Godzilla films being quite interesting in their own right, they're also real outliers in terms of his broad career spectrum, which again I think makes Omori a very fascinating figure to have worked on the Godzilla franchise. Throughout his later years, Omori was active at film festivals. He was a judge at several festivals in Tokyo, including the Tokyo International Film Festival. In this picture here, we see him with the great French actress Jeanne Moreau, which I'm sure was a great delight for Omori, because in addition to being a fan of early French the French New Wave, one of his all-time favorite movies was John Frankenheimer's 1964 film The Train, which co-stars Jeanne Moreau. In the 2000s, he became an instructor at various universities in Osaka. In his for the last 15 or so years of his life, he was a professor at the Osaka University of Arts. However, during this time period, he was not quite done with special effects. Although he wouldn't work on Godzilla henceforth, he wasn't quite done with the realm of special effects, and namely with practical special effects, because he was attached to some projects, in the later parts of his life. One of the big what ifs for me is he was originally attached to work on Shochiku's unmade adaptation of Sakio Komatsu's novel Japan Sinks, which is, of course, the source novel for the 1973 submersion of Japan, as well as Shinji Higuchi's The Sinking of Japan, and various other adaptations. The film was ultimately not produced. And by the way, in this picture, we see Omori with Sakio Komatsu, promoting the project, which unfortunately was never produced. In 2008, he was on the screenwriting team for Masaki Tezuka's Rescue Wings, which is a live-action version of an anime about, a heroic rescue pilot who has to prove herself. Not terribly unlike Tezuka's other films. Now, all of Tezuka's films, kaiju and non-kaiju, tend to have the same narrative beats. Focus on the military and a character who has to prove themselves, but that's a tangent for another day. But anyhow, Omori worked on that screenplay, and of course, he was also reunited with Koichi Kawakita in some of these later projects. For example, there was Super Caesar X the movie, which brought back the Gotengo from Atragon. That was the idea of Kawakita, but I'm sure it was a joy to Omori, because Atragon was one of his childhood favorites. At that period where he was still interested in Japanese special effects, Atragon was one of the films that really impressed him. And when he was promoting Godzilla vs. BIOLLANTE decades later, he cited Atragon as one of the films that he still had a very strong visceral memory of, because it impressed him so much. And this film also includes practical effects and suitmation and so on and so forth. And of course, his collaboration with Kawakita involved having Kawakita come to Osaka University of Arts and help teach courses on handcrafted special effects. And their collaboration at Osaka University of Arts also led to this 4-part television miniseries, Gunbot, which was, I believe, the last project that Kawakita worked on before his passing. And when Steve Rifle and I interviewed Omori last year, he said that he could not imagine ever working on a Godzilla film again without Mr. Kawakita, which I think is a very nice little testimony to his former collaborator. But anyway, that's just a small little sample of Omori's the broad spectrum of his career. Again, a very active life, active in cinema, long before he was involved with Godzilla and long after he was involved with Godzilla. He was, as I mentioned before, the only director of that Heisei cycle to really have a full, sustained directing career. Kept making movies long after the time his time with the monster was done. And a very fascinating figure to study and observe in the pantheon of the Godzilla series. Not just the first freelance Godzilla director, not just the first Godzilla director born in the post-war era, not just a director who was openly not a fan. Well, he wasn't the first, but he was a director who wasn't openly fond of the monster. Didn't have a whole lot of personal fondness for it, but still prevailed as one of the more interesting Godzilla directors in this, one of the most interesting figures to study in this franchise. And so Kazuki Omori, as far as I'm concerned, is a figure well worth studying. And I hope that this presentation has shed some light on just the very fascinating figure he was. And I hope this creates some additional interest in his work outside of the monster. And so thank you for joining me for the special presentation at Kaiju Masterclass. I am Patrick Galvan, and this has been a retrospective on the legacy of the late Kazuki Omori.